You would very kindly allow us into your homes every Saturday, then the least that we, and I do mean we, all of us on World of Sport can do is to wish you the happiest of Christmases. Go on, kids. Happy Christmas.
The voice of football once belonged to Dickie Davies until 1995, when everything fell into silence. One devastating stroke didn't just force him off the air. It felt like a legend was suddenly erased while the world watched in disbelief. How does a man who helped define an era vanish so quietly? Was this simply tragedy? Or was this the moment one of football's greatest voices was buried before his story was finished? Because when Dickie Davies disappeared from the spotlight, fans didn't just lose a broadcaster, they lost a piece of the game itself. And the haunting question remains, for a man whose greatest weapon had always been his voice, the stroke in 1995 struck with almost cruel symbolism. Dickie Davies wasn't just fighting illness, he was fighting the loss of the very thing that made him iconic. The smooth authority that once carried football drama across millions of homes was suddenly threatened, and for many, that was harder to comprehend than the medical emergency itself. This was the voice of big match Saturdays falling silent, and when even his speech was affected, it felt as if fate had attacked the core of his identity. For a broadcaster built on command and presence, this was not just a setback, it was devastation. At the height of his stature, even his work with Classic FM reflected how respected he had become beyond football. But after the stroke, that world shifted overnight. The man who once delivered authority with effortless precision was forced away from the microphone, and the public suddenly saw a giant made vulnerable. What made it more dramatic was that this wasn't happening to a fading figure, it was happening to a broadcasting institution. His role as sports editor, once a symbol of continued relevance, was abruptly interrupted. And for many watching, it felt like the curtain had fallen without warning. What made this period haunting was not only the illness itself, but the long silence that followed. Dickie Davies, once constantly present in the public eye, retreated into recovery while the football world kept moving. For a figure tied to visibility and weekly ritual, absence created mystery. Rumors grew, concern deepened, and many wondered whether the voice they knew would ever return. The recovery was private, painful, and slow, but to fans, it felt like watching a legend disappear into shadows. And that silence only strengthened the idea that he had been buried from public life. Yet, what made this chapter so dramatic was how much it revealed about the man behind the television image. Away from the cameras, Davies was fighting a battle far greater than ratings or headlines. He was struggling to reclaim speech itself, to recover dignity, to rebuild a life after a blow many never return from. For someone whose career was built on flawless delivery, losing command of words was almost unthinkable. But that tragedy became one of the darkest and most defining turns of his story, because sometimes a legend's hardest contest happens far from the stadium lights. And perhaps that is why this period became one of the most emotional chapters in the story of Dickie Davies. At the peak of recognition, a single medical crisis changed everything, ending one era and beginning a long fight few truly saw. His absence from the screen wasn't just professional loss, it felt like football itself had lost one of its great narrators. What should have been years of continued prominence became years of struggle, and in that silence after the stroke, the myth began growing. That one of Sky-era broadcasting's biggest names had not simply stepped away, but had been pushed into history before his time. In 1995, when the stroke robbed Dickie Davies of speech, it felt almost impossible to imagine a comeback. For a man whose identity was built around voice and command, losing the power to speak seemed like the cruelest collapse imaginable. The silence surrounding him grew heavier because few understood how serious the fight truly was. This was no short interruption. It was the beginning of a battle that threatened to erase everything he had built, and for many who believed story ended there. They had no idea a second act was quietly forming, because legends do not always disappear when the world assumes they have. What followed was nearly 2 years of therapy, struggle, and determination, a recovery as dramatic as any sporting comeback he had ever narrated. While the public mostly saw absence, behind that absence was relentless rebuilding. Every word regained carried weight. Every step towards speech was a victory. For someone who once made broadcasting seem effortless, relearning what had once come naturally became its own heroic chapter, and slowly the silence that seemed permanent began to crack. What looked like the burial of a career was beginning to resemble resistance. That is what made his return so powerful in the late 1990s. When Dickie Davies came back fronting Dickie Davies' Sporting Heroes, it wasn't just another television appearance. It felt like resurrection. The voice many feared was gone forever had returned. There was history in that comeback, because viewers weren't just seeing a presenter back on screen, they were witnessing survival. The same man many believed had vanished into silence was suddenly telling stories again, and that alone turned tragedy into something almost defiant. His appearances in World of Sport anniversary specials only deepened that sense of legacy restored. These were not nostalgic cameos, they felt like proof that the game had not forgotten one of its great storytellers. The man once forced away by illness was reclaiming his place in football memory, and what made it emotional was that his comeback carried more meaning than his original fame, because now he represented endurance as much as broadcasting greatness. He was no longer just returning to television, he was returning from silence itself, and maybe that is what makes this chapter one of the most remarkable parts of the Dickie Davies story. In 1995, a stroke seemed to end everything. 2 years of therapy looked like a fight few could win, yet by the late 1990s, he had turned disappearance into comeback and silence into legacy. What many saw as a buried career became a story of return, and in that return, Dickie Davies proved something extraordinary, that even when history seems to close its doors on a legend, sometimes the legend walks back through them. When news broke on 19th of February 2023 that Dickie Davies had passed away at 94, it felt as though an era itself had taken its final breath. This was no ordinary obituary. It was the closing chapter of a voice tied to generations of football memory. For many, the phrase "buried in silence" returned with new meaning, not because he had been forgotten, but because the game suddenly sounded quieter without him in it. The man who had narrated so much drama had now become part of history's own final whistle, and once again, silence surrounded his name. But this time, it was the silence of mourning. What deepened the emotion was the response from his longtime colleague Jim Rosenthal, whose call for privacy for the family carried a solemn weight. There were no grand spectacles, no noisy farewell tour, only dignity in grief. That request for quiet made many reflect on how often silence had framed Davies' story, from the stroke in 1995 to his disappearance from screens, and now to the respectful hush after death. It almost felt poetic. The man once forced into silence by tragedy was now being honored through silence itself, and that made his ending feel even more haunting. But what made his passing resonate so deeply was that people were not only mourning a broadcaster, they were mourning a time in sport that seemed to vanish with him. World of Sport, the golden age of football broadcasting, the familiar weekend rituals, so much of that memory carried his voice. His death reopened those memories all at once. Fans were not just grieving Dickie Davies, they were grieving the era he represented, and that is why his passing felt larger than loss. It felt like the closing of a sporting generation. Yet, even in death, there was something powerful about how his legacy refused to disappear. Tributes poured in, old broadcasts resurfaced, and people were reminded why Dickie Davies mattered so much. The same voice nearly stolen in 1995 now echoed through remembrance. The silence silence around his death did not erase him, it amplified what he had meant, because sometimes legends speak loudest after they are gone, and in those tributes, it became clear Dickie Davies had not been buried in silence at all. He had been preserved in reverence. Looking back, his story almost feels shaped by three silences. The first came with the stroke that threatened his voice. The second came in the years he disappeared from public life. And the third came after 2023, when mourning wrapped around his memory, but each silence carried a different truth: survival, return, and legacy. What once looked like absence was often resilience in disguise, and that changes the meaning of the whole story, because this was never truly about a man buried in silence. It was about a legend who kept rising through it. And maybe that is the real reason Dickie Davies' story still lingers. Not because silence consumed him, but because he turned silence into part of his myth. From the stroke, to the comeback, to the final farewell, Dickie Davies remained larger than tragedy. He survived disappearance, returned when many thought he was gone, and left behind a legacy too enduring to be muted. So when people ask why he was buried in silence, perhaps they are asking the wrong question, because, in truth, Dickie Davies was never buried in silence. He became immortal through everything he overcame.